Darkness. Not the comfortable kind you find when closing your eyes at night. This was the crushing, suffocating darkness that lived in bones and erased memories of light. 872 years of it. That's not a metaphor or an exaggeration. 8 centuries and 72 years of absolute void, where time moved like cold honey, and sanity was a luxury most couldn't afford. But in that darkness, something stirred. A pair of eyes opened, glowing crimson like dying stars. Kale Voidstrider was waking up, and the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The abyssal dungeon. Even the name carried weight, spoken in whispers by those who knew its history. Built by the old Mage Council specifically to contain threats too dangerous to execute, but too valuable to kill outright. Kale's cell sat at the deepest level, carved from obsidian that drank magic like sand drinks water. Every surface crawled with suppression runes, each one a masterpiece of paranoid genius, designed to ensure that whoever entered these walls would never, ever leave. The chains binding Kale were forged from something beyond normal metal. Godbone, they called it, the ossified remains of deities who'd lost their wars and been rendered down into raw materials. Each link was inscribed with glyphs that would have taken normal mages years to decode. Together, they formed a web of restraint that could have held back armies. Kale's first conscious thought in centuries was simple. Those chains were cracking, not breaking, not yet, but cracking. Hair-thin fractures spreading through the godbone like ice forming on a winter pond. The dark magic that had been compressed inside him for 872 years wasn't sleeping anymore. It was waking up, stretching, testing the boundaries that had held it for so impossibly long. His second thought was more complex. He was still breathing. Technically. His body had been sustained through magical means, kept in a state of hibernation that wasn't quite death, but certainly wasn't life. Now that suspended animation was ending, and the transition hurt in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Every nerve ending screamed as blood began flowing again. Every muscle protested as if asking why they were being disturbed after such a long rest. Kale forced his eyes to focus. The cell looked exactly as he remembered it. 12 feet by 12 feet. No windows. A single door reinforced with enough magic to stop a dragon. The walls were covered in additional runes, layer upon layer of them, like someone had kept adding security measures every time they thought of a new way he might escape. It would have been flattering if it wasn't so infuriating. But something was different. Dust. Centuries of it, coating every surface in a gray blanket, and the runes themselves. Some were flickering. Others had gone dark entirely. The magical power that sustained the abyssal dungeon was failing, had been failing for years, maybe decades. No one was maintaining this place anymore, which meant no one was coming to stop him. Kale sat up slowly, every movement deliberate. The chains groaned in protest, their cracks widening. He could feel his magic now, really feel it, coiled in his core like a sleeping dragon. But it wasn't the same magic he'd had before. 872 years of compression had changed it fundamentally. It was denser now, darker, more concentrated. Like wine aged in a forgotten cellar, it had become something entirely new. He reached for that power, just a trickle, at first. The response was immediate. Shadows gathered at his fingertips, solid enough to touch. That was new. Before his imprisonment, his dark magic had been primarily curse work and detection spells. Now it had a physical component, as if the boundary between shadow and substance had become negotiable. The first chain shattered with a sound like a bell being struck backward. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. Each breaking released more of his sealed power, and with it came memories. Not pleasant ones. He remembered his trial. Remembered standing before the Mage Council while they listed his crimes. Unauthorized research. Spreading dangerous theories. Attempting to expose the Academy of Immortals for what it really was. a system designed to harvest magical energy from students under the guise of teaching them. He remembered his former mentor reading the sentence, unable to meet his eyes. Life imprisonment in the abyssal dungeon, in a cell designed specifically for him. No trial date, no possibility of appeal. Just darkness and time, stretching forward into infinity. The final chain fell away, and Kale stood fully for the first time in 8 centuries. His body was gaunt, muscles atrophied despite the preservation magic. His skin had gone pale as moonlight, and his hair, once dark brown, had turned silver. He looked like a ghost, which seemed appropriate. That's essentially what he was, Aita, ghost from an age that had moved on without him. The cell door was the next obstacle. It was warded 6 ways to midnight, each spell a potential death trap. Kale placed his palm against the cold metal and felt the defensive magics activate, probing him, trying to categorize the threat he represented. The wards were designed to respond to specific types of magic with specific countermeasures. But his magic had evolved beyond their programming. They didn't know what to do with these living shadows, this darkness that moved with intelligence and purpose. Kale didn't break the wards. He convinced them they didn't need to be there. The shadows slipped between the magical circuits, rewriting their logic from the inside. The door unlocked with a soft click that echoed in the absolute silence of the abandoned prison. Beyond was a corridor that stretched into darkness in both directions. No lights, no guards, just more dust and the faint smell of decay. Kyle chose, left arbitrarily, and began walking, his bare feet silent on the stone floor. Every few hundred feet he passed another cell, each one sealed and dark. Some still hummed with active magic. Others were empty, their prisoners long since dead or transferred. He stopped at one cell and peered through the observation slit. Inside, a skeleton sat against the wall, still chained. This prisoner had been forgotten, left to die slowly while the dungeon fell into disrepair. How many others had suffered the same fate? How many brilliant minds, dangerous criminals, or simply inconvenient truth-tellers had been sealed away down here and abandoned? Kale's expression hardened. The council had been monsters, but at least they'd been competent monsters. Whoever had replaced them was worse. They'd inherited a system of imprisonment and simply let it rot, along with everyone inside it. The corridor eventually led to a spiral staircase carved directly into the mountain stone. Kale climbed, his breathing growing heavier as his body remembered it needed oxygen. The staircase went up and up, hundreds of steps, maybe thousands. Time had lost meaning during his imprisonment, and he found himself unable to estimate how long he climbed. It could have been an hour, could have been 4. At the top he found a guard station. More skeletons, these ones in the remains of ceremonial armor. One was slumped over a desk, a journal still clutched in bony fingers. Kyle gently extracted the journal and read the final entry. Day 43. No supplies. No communication. The crystals are dead. We're trapped just as surely as the prisoners. We guard. Marcus stopped talking yesterday. I think he's given up. I should probably give up too. But what's the point? If we die at our post or die trying to escape, we're still dead. At least here we die with some dignity intact. I hope someone finds this someday. I hope they know we didn't abandon our duty. We were abandoned. Kale set the journal down carefully. These guards had been victims too, in their own way. Pawns in a larger game, forgotten when they stopped being useful. The main gates of the abyssal dungeon were massive things, 20 feet tall and covered in inscriptions proclaiming the righteousness and power of the Mage Council. They hung partially open, their mechanisms seized up long ago. Kale pushed through the gap and stepped outside into light. Blinding, overwhelming, painful light. After 872 years in absolute darkness, even the gray, overcast sky of early morning felt like staring into the sun. Kale stood there, eyes streaming, forcing himself to adapt. His vision slowly adjusted, details emerging from the painful brightness. The dungeon was built into a mountainside overlooking a valley. Cale's memories told him this valley should contain farmland, forests, maybe a few small villages. What he saw instead defied belief. The valley was filled with a city, but not any city from his time. This was something else entirely. Towers, of glass and steel reaching toward the sky, connected by bridges that glowed with magical energy. Flying vehicles moved between the buildings like schools of fish, their passengers visible through transparent hulls. And everywhere, there was magic. Not hidden or subtle, but bold and ubiquitous. Street lamps that burned with captured starlight. Signs that shifted their messages using illusion spells. The very air hummed with overlapping enchantments. 872 years. The world hadn't just changed. It had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Cale's gaze was drawn to 7 towers arranged in a perfect circle at the city's heart. Even from this distance, he could feel the power emanating from them. Something about their arrangement triggered a memory, but he couldn't quite grasp it. That pattern meant something. Something important. A path led down from the dungeon entrance, overgrown and crumbling but still visible. Cale began descending, each step taking him further from his centuries of captivity and deeper into an uncertain future. His body was weak, his magical control uncertain, and he had no idea what kind of world awaited him at the bottom of this mountain. But he was free. After 872 years, he was finally, impossibly free, and he had work to do. The Academy of Immortals, if it still existed, needed to answer for its crimes. The students it had exploited needed justice. The system it represented needed to be torn down, no matter how many centuries had passed. Cale Voidstrider had been many things in his life. A prodigy, a rebel, a prisoner. Now he would become something new, something the modern world wasn't prepared for. He would become a reckoning. The path down the mountain was treacherous, made worse by Cale's weakened state. His legs trembled after the first mile, muscles screaming in protest. 872 years of immobility couldn't be overcome in a day, no matter how much dark magic sustained him. But Cale pushed through the pain, driven by a need to understand what his world had become. About halfway down, he encountered another person for the first time. An elderly man sat on a stone marker, resting from his own climb. He wore clothing unlike anything from Cale's era, form-fitting fabric that seemed to regulate temperature automatically, with subtle light threads woven through it that pulsed gently. Even the man's walking staff was clearly enchanted, its wood carved with efficiency runes that would reduce fatigue. The old man looked up as Cale approached, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to concern. "Young man, you look terrible. Are you injured? Lost?" Kyle realized he must present quite a sight, gaunt to the point of skeletal, wearing nothing but tattered prison garments that were literally 8 centuries old, his silver hair wild and unkempt. He probably looked like he'd crawled out of a grave. "I'm recovering from an ordeal," Cale managed, his voice rough from disuse. "I've been away for a very long time. The world seems different." The old man chuckled, apparently taking this as philosophical musing rather than literal truth. "Away on a spiritual journey, were you? You young people in your vision quests." But his eyes were kind as he rummaged through his pack. "Here, water and food. You look like you need both." Cale accepted gratefully, forcing himself to drink slowly despite his body's demands. The water was cool and pure, tasting of mountain springs. The food was dense bread studded with nuts and dried fruit, simple but nourishing. After centuries of magical sustenance, real food was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," Cale said quietly. "You're generous to help a stranger." "Bah. We're all strangers until we're not. That's what my father always said." The old man settled back against his marker, clearly in no hurry. So where are you headed? Back to civilization, I assume. That city in the valley. What's it called? Threshold City, heart of the Eastern Consortium. You really have been away, haven't you? Threshold's been the capital for 300 years now. The old man gestured toward those 7 towers Cale had noticed. That's the Academy of Immortals. My granddaughter just got accepted this year. Brightest moment of her life, she says. Cale's hand tightened on the water skin. The Academy. Still standing, still operating, still recruiting students with promises of immortality. 872 years, and nothing had changed where it mattered most. Congratulations to your granddaughter, he said, keeping his voice neutral. What happened to the old Mage Council? I've been disconnected from news. The old man's expression darkened. The council? They collapsed 700 years ago. Good riddance. Turned out they were as corrupt as everyone suspected. Illegal experiments, exploitation. The whole rotten mess came to light. There was a revolution of sorts. The common mages and lesser nobility rose up and demanded change. The Arcane Consortium was formed to replace the council, supposedly more democratic and accountable. 700 years. The council had only lasted about a century after imprisoning Cale. There was bitter irony in that. They'd sacrificed him to hide their crimes, and those crimes had destroyed them anyway. And the Academy of Immortals? I assume it's connected. To the new government? Technically independent, but there's overlap in leadership. Many consortium officials are Academy graduates. The Academy claims to be completely reformed from its old ways. Transparent, merit-based admission, legitimate magical education. My granddaughter's going there on scholarship, actually. Couldn't afford it otherwise. The old man's pride was evident. She's got real talent, that girl. Probably going to be a great mage someday. Cale said nothing, but his mind was racing. The Academy was still recruiting, still promising immortality, still integrated into the power structure. The question was whether they'd genuinely reformed or simply gotten better at hiding their exploitation. I should continue, Cale said, standing carefully. Thank you again for the food and water, and the information. Where will you go in Threshold? Do you have family there? Friends? No one. But I'll find my way. I always do. The old man looked concerned but didn't press. Well, if you need work or shelter, head to the lower city. They call it the Undercity. Not as pretty as the upper districts, but more opportunities for those starting with nothing. Ask for the Broken Crown Tavern. The owner helps people who are down on their luck, though she'll expect you to work for it. Kyle committed the information to memory. The Broken Crown. I'll remember. Thank you. He continued down the path, leaving the old man behind. The descent took hours, his weakened body forcing frequent rests. But eventually the mountain path merged with a proper road, smoothly paved with some material that wasn't quite stone, but held enchantments for durability and traction. The road was busy with travelers, most using those flying vehicles Kyle had, seen from above. Up close, they were even more impressive. Crystalline constructs that defied conventional physics, held aloft by sophisticated levitation magic. Some were personal transports, barely larger than a person. Others were massive, cargo carriers, hauling goods between cities. And the people, humans, certainly, but also elves, dwarves, beings made of living crystal, individuals whose forms shifted between solid and gaseous states. The magical world had opened up dramatically, incorporating species that Cale either didn't recognize or that simply hadn't been part of mainstream society in his time. No one paid him much attention. A ragged figure walking alongside the road wasn't unusual enough to merit stares, apparently. Kyle was grateful for the anonymity. He needed time to observe and understand before making his presence known. As he approached the city proper, the differences between old and new became even more pronounced. Threshold City was built in layers, with the oldest structures at ground level and newer construction reaching ever upward. The architecture blended styles from multiple eras. Kyle could see buildings he remembered from his time, now dwarfed by the towers around them but still standing. The city gates were more like checkpoints than defensive structures. Guards in standardized uniforms monitored incoming traffic, but they seemed focused on commercial vehicles rather than pedestrians. Kale walked through without challenge, just another anonymous newcomer seeking opportunity in the big city. Inside Threshold, the sensory overload intensified. Every surface seemed designed to catch the eye. Animated advertisements flickered on building walls. Street performers used magic to create elaborate illusions. Vendors hawked goods with enchanted amplification, making their voices carry for blocks. The noise was constant, overwhelming after centuries of silence. Kyle followed the flow of pedestrian traffic downward, toward what he assumed was the undercity the old man had mentioned. The transition was gradual, buildings getting older, streets getting narrower, the bright magical displays giving way to more practical lighting. The people changed too, becoming more rough-edged, more wary. The undercity wasn't a slum exactly, but it clearly existed in the shadow of the upper city's prosperity. Buildings here were centuries old, modified and retrofitted with cheap magical technology that kept them functional if not elegant. The residents had the look of people who'd learned that survival required constant vigilance. Kale felt oddly at home. He'd grown up in places like this, before the Academy noticed his talent and pulled him into their world. The undercity had its own logic, its own rules, and unlike the upper city with its gleaming facades, here you could see things as they really were. Finding the broken crown took some asking around, but the locals were surprisingly helpful once they saw Kale wasn't a threat. The tavern sat on a corner that had probably seen better centuries, its exterior deliberately designed to look half-ruined. But Kale could see the sophisticated wardwork hidden beneath the decay. This place was a fortress disguised as a ruin. He knocked 3 times, then twice more. A universal pattern that meant business, not trouble. After a moment, a viewing slot opened and suspicious eyes examined him. "We're closed," a gruff voice announced. "I was told the owner helps people in difficult circumstances. I'm willing to work in exchange for information and shelter." The eyes narrowed, assessing. Then the slot closed, and Kale heard multiple locks disengaging. The door opened to reveal a dwarf woman covered in protective tattoos that pulsed with active magic. She carried a warhammer that radiated enough force to level buildings. "Name?" "Kyle. Just Kyle." "And what makes you think Mira Shadowvane wants to help you specifically?" "I'm a dark magic practitioner who just escaped from 800 years of imprisonment, and I'm here to investigate whether the Academy of Immortals is still exploiting students. I figure that's interesting enough to get me through the door." The dwarf stared at him for a long moment, then actually laughed. "You're either crazy, suicidal, or telling the truth. Maybe all 3. Come in. And keep your hands visible." Kale entered the broken crown, immediately noting the multiple defensive systems tracking his every movement. The interior was surprisingly comfortable despite the exterior's appearance. A few patrons occupied the main room, all of them with the look of people involved in gray market activities. The dwarf, presumably not Mira herself, led him to a back office. She knocked once, got a response, then opened the door. "Boss got a walk-in with an interesting story. Says he's been imprisoned for 800 years and wants to investigate the Academy." "That is interesting. Send him in." Kale entered to find a sharp-eyed woman reviewing documents at a desk covered in magical quills that wrote automatically. This was Mira Shadowvane, information broker, by the look of things. She gestured to a chair across from her. 800 years, she said without preamble. "The Abyssal Dungeon, I assume? That's the only prison designed for long-term magical containment. which means you're either historically significant, incredibly dangerous, or both. Does it matter which? Not particularly. What matters is what you want now. Mira pulled out a crystal that began glowing softly. Truth stone. I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I want an honest answer. Are your intentions toward the Academy hostile or peaceful? Kale looked at the stone and considered carefully. That depends on whether they're still practicing the same exploitation they did 8 centuries ago. If they've genuinely reformed, I have no quarrel with them. If they're still feeding on students' life force under the guise of granting immortality, then yes, my intentions are hostile. The crystal's light remained steady. Truth. Mira's expression shifted to something like respect. Most people try to dance around that question. You answered directly. She put the crystal away. I can help you. But information about the Academy doesn't come cheap, and looking at you, gold is in short supply. I'm willing to work off the debt. I'm a skilled practitioner of dark magic, ward work, curse breaking, detection, some combat applications. Dark. Magic is rare these days, heavily regulated because of old prejudices. Mira pulled out a folder. I have a job that's been unclaimed for months. Probably cursed. Definitely dangerous. Complete it, and I'll give you basic information about the Academy's current operations. More detailed intelligence would require additional work, she explained, about a warehouse sealed by aggressive defensive magic. 3 teams had tried to enter. All had failed, with casualties. The city wanted it cleared, but wouldn't pay enough to interest professional curse breakers. Kale studied the photograph she showed him. The magic was sophisticated but old, probably predating the consortium. He could work with that. I'll do it, he said. But I need supplies. Basic tools, protective gear, food, and clothes that don't mark me as a prisoner. Consider it a loan against your success. Mira's smile was sharp. Helga will show you to a safe room. Food will be sent up. Tomorrow morning, you can tackle the warehouse. Try not to die. I'd hate to lose the investment. The room Helga showed him was small, but clean, with an actual bed. Kyle sat on it carefully, still adjusting to the concept of basic comfort. Through the window, he could see the Undercity's constant motion. Life continuing regardless of who returned from the dead. 872 years. The world had moved on without him, evolved into something barely recognizable. Magic, that had been secret and controlled, was now ubiquitous. The council that imprisoned him had fallen. New powers had risen. But the Academy of Immortals still stood, still recruited, still promised eternal life to desperate students. Some things, it seemed, were harder to kill than others. Kyle laid back on the bed, exhaustion finally overwhelming his racing thoughts. Tomorrow he would tackle the warehouse, earn his information, and begin piecing together what the Academy had really become. Tonight, for the first time in 872 years, he would sleep as a free man. The dreams that came were dark and filled with shadows. But Kale had spent centuries in darkness. He knew how to navigate it. And tomorrow, he would begin teaching the modern world what that darkness could do. 3 weeks had passed since Kale cleared the warehouse, a task that turned out more complicated than expected. The defensive curses were sophisticated, layered, designed to kill intruders in creative ways. But Kale's evolved dark magic had given him advantages the original ward makers never anticipated. He'd broken through, cataloged the contents, and earned Mira's respect along with her information. The intelligence she provided was damning. Students disappeared at a statistical rate that defied innocent explanation. The Ascension ceremony remained, closed to outside observation. Graduates spoke of their academy experience with identical rehearsed enthusiasm that suggested either coaching or magical compulsion. And multiple former students who'd refused Ascension had either vanished or suffered suspicious accidents. It was the same pattern from 8 centuries ago, just more refined, more insidious. Mira had also delivered on creating his false identity. Kale Shadowend, dark magic specialist from the Twilight Reaches, recent arrival in Threshold City. The documentation was solid enough to pass casual inspection, and his growing reputation in the Undercity gave the identity credibility. Now, standing before the Academy's main gates, Kale was about to test whether that identity would hold under scrutiny. The Academy of Immortals occupied those 7 towers he'd seen from the mountain, each one reaching hundreds of feet into the sky. They were connected by crystalline bridges that shifted colors as students crossed them, apparently responding to magical signatures. The grounds between the towers were meticulously maintained gardens where students studied, practiced spells, or simply socialized. It looked like paradise, a place where magical excellence was cultivated and celebrated, where anyone with talent could achieve greatness. Kale knew better. Paradise usually had a price, and at the Academy, that price was measured in life force and freedom. He approached the main administration building, following the signs for professional services registration. The Academy apparently hired outside contractors for various functions, an opportunity Mira had identified for him to gain access. The receptionist was an elf woman whose age was impossible to determine. She looked up from her work with professional courtesy. "Good afternoon. How may the Academy assist you? I'm here to register as a contractor, dark magic specialist. I understand the Academy occasionally requires such expertise." Her expression flickered with something surprise, concern, before settling back into neutrality. Dark magic. Yes, we do have occasional need. However, we require extensive background verification for all contractors. The process can take several months. I understand. I'm prepared to wait. Kale placed his documentation on her desk. I've been establishing my practice in the Undercity for the past few weeks. You'll find references from clients I've assisted. The elf examined his papers with the thoroughness of someone trained to spot forgeries. Kyle kept his expression calm, confident. The documents would hold up to this level of inspection. Mira was too good at her job for them not to. Kale Shadowend, from the Twilight Reaches. She looked up at him. That's quite distant. What brought you to Threshold City? Opportunity. The Twilight Reaches are remote, traditional. Here, magic is integrated into daily life in ways that interest me professionally. I wanted to be part of that. It was a good cover story, because it was partially true. Threshold City's magical infrastructure did fascinate Kale, even if his primary interest was infiltrating the Academy. The elf made notations on a form that appeared to be filling itself out based on his documentation. Your credentials appear, in order, though naturally we'll need to verify them. In the meantime, would you be willing to demonstrate your capabilities? We have a testing chamber for potential contractors. This was expected. Kyle nodded. Of course. What sort of demonstration did you have in mind? Follow me. She led him deeper into the administration building, through corridors that hummed with protective enchantments. Kale noted the security measures carefully, wards designed to prevent teleportation, scrying blockers, something that felt like a massive detection grid mapping everyone's magical signature. The testing chamber was a large room with walls covered in absorbing materials designed to contain magical effects. 3 mages waited inside, presumably the examiners. 2 humans and an elf, all wearing Academy faculty robes marked with complex rank insignia. Mr. Shadowend, the senior examiner said, a human woman with gray-streaked hair. I'm Professor Ariana Brightwell, head of the Void Magic Department. These are my colleagues, Professors Marcus Chen and Lisa Thornhart. We'll be evaluating your abilities. Kyle inclined his head respectfully. Thank you for your time, professors. Let's begin with something basic. Create a ward against mental intrusion. Make it as strong as you can. Kyle extended his hand, gathering his dark magic. Shadows coalesced at his fingertips, spinning into intricate patterns. He wove them into a ward structure. Not his best work, but impressive enough to demonstrate skill without revealing his full capabilities. The completed ward shimmered in the air, a sphere of condensed shadow that would deflect most mental attacks. Professor Chen probed the ward with diagnostic magic, his expression growing thoughtful. Unusual construction. Most dark magic practitioners use fear-based deterrence. Yours is more sophisticated, almost elegant. I prefer precision over brute force, Kale replied. Fear-based wards are effective but crude. They can be overcome with sufficient willpower. This ward doesn't try to frighten attackers. It simply redirects their efforts into harmless channels. Demonstrate curse detection, Professor Brightwell commanded. She produced an ornate dagger, clearly cursed. Kale examined it without touching, using his magical senses to perceive the curse's structure. It was a nasty piece of work. Death curse keyed to activate on contact, with a secondary effect that would spread to anyone who'd touched the victim in the previous day. Death curse with contagion propagation, Kale said. Quite lethal. Designed by someone with extensive knowledge of dark magic, and probably a personal grudge against the intended victim. The construction suggests it was made within the last 2 years. Professor Brightwell's eyebrows rose. Impressive. Can you remove it? I could, but doing so in a testing environment seems unwise. The curse would need somewhere to go when broken, and containing that much destructive energy safely requires specific precautions. A diplomatic answer, and correct. We would indeed need proper containment. She set the dagger aside. One final test. We have a problem that's been plaguing the Academy for several weeks. One of our ancient archives has become difficult to access. The protective wards have become aggressive, attacking anyone who attempts entry. If you can diagnose the problem, you'll have proven your worth. Now this was interesting. Access to an Academy archive, even with supervision, could provide valuable intelligence. I'd be happy to examine it. They led him to a different building, one that felt older than the others. The archive entrance was sealed by a door covered in writhing shadows that looked disturbingly similar to those Kale had encountered at the warehouse. He studied them carefully, extending his senses. The wards weren't malfunctioning. They were protecting something specific, something that shouldn't be disturbed. These defenses aren't aggressive by design, Kyle said slowly. They're responding to perceived threats. Something inside the archive has attracted unwanted attention, and the wards are reacting by becoming more hostile. Can you determine what's causing the reaction? Kale placed his hand near the shadows, not quite touching. They swirled toward him, then pulled back, as if uncertain. His dark magic resonated with them on some fundamental level. Someone's been trying to breach the archive using incompatible magic, he said. Likely fire or light-based spells. The wards were designed by a dark magic practitioner. They interpret bright magic as hostile by default. Each attempted breach made them more defensive. Professor Brightwell exchanged glances with her colleagues. That's exactly correct. We've had students trying various approaches, each one making the situation worse. Can you calm the wards? Possibly, but I'd need time alone with them. Wards this sophisticated require delicate handling, and having observers makes them more suspicious. That's not our standard protocol? I understand. But if you want this fixed, those are my terms. I'm not asking for unsupervised access to the archive contents, just privacy to work on the defenses, Professor Chen spoke up. We could observe from the monitoring room. Visual only, no magical interference. Would that be acceptable? Kyle pretended to consider, then nodded. That's reasonable. They left him alone with the wards, though he knew they were watching through hidden observation points. He approached the shadows carefully, speaking to them in the wordless language of dark magic. Like at the warehouse, these defenses recognized something familiar in his power. The wards parted slowly, granting him access. Kale stepped through into the archive beyond. The room was filled with shelves containing ancient texts, scrolls, and artifacts. Everything was meticulously organized and protected by individual preservation spells. Kale moved through the stacks, carefully, searching for whatever had attracted the wrong kind of attention. He found it in a back corner, a collection of documents marked with dates from 700 years ago, right around the time of the council's collapse. These were administrative records, communications, financial ledgers, the kind of boring paperwork that historians loved and everyone else ignored. Except these particular records detailed expenditures related to student processing and life force allocation, evidence of the Academy's original crimes, hidden away but not destroyed. Kale memorized several key document locations, making mental notes of what needed deeper investigation. Then he carefully adjusted the wards to be less aggressive while maintaining their protective function. The shadows calmed, settling back into their dormant state. He emerged from the archive to find the 3 professors waiting. "It's done. The wards should be accessible now, though I'd recommend using dark magic practitioners for future maintenance. They respond better to familiar resonance." Professor Brightwell tested the entrance cautiously. The shadows remained calm, parting to allow her passage. "Remarkable. You accomplished in 30 minutes what we've been attempting for weeks. Sometimes old magic needs old approaches." "Indeed." She smiled approvingly. "I believe we've seen enough, Mr. Shadowend. Assuming your background verification clears, and I see no reason it wouldn't, the Academy would like to offer you a contractor position. Part-time initially, with possibility of expansion based on need and performance. Would that interest you?" "Very much, Professor." "Excellent. We'll contact you once the verification is complete. Expect to hear from us within 2 weeks." Kyle left the Academy with his heart racing. He'd done it. Gained official access, demonstrated value, and identified evidence that confirmed the Academy's continued exploitation. The documents in that archive would be crucial to building a case. But more importantly, he'd seen how the Academy operated now. The casual security, the layers of protection, the way they categorized and controlled everyone who entered their grounds. It was sophisticated, thoroughly integrated, designed to be nearly impossible to challenge from outside. Good thing he was now inside. Back in the Undercity, Mira listened to his report with growing excitement. "You actually found documentary evidence? That's better than I hoped." "The documents are 700 years old, but they establish a pattern. If we can prove the same practices continue today, we'll have a historical basis for the accusation. And your contractor position gives you legitimate reasons to access Academy facilities." Mira's smile was sharp. "This might actually work. You might actually be able to expose them." "Maybe. But I need to be careful. One mistake, and I'll disappear just like those other students who asked too many questions." "Then don't make mistakes." Kyle spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He studied modern magic theory, learning how the discipline had evolved during his imprisonment. He practiced controlling his power more precisely, ensuring his dark magic wouldn't give away his true nature. He built relationships in the Undercity, creating a network of contacts who could provide information and support, and he thought about the students at the Academy, young people full of hope and ambition, believing they were working toward immortality, not knowing they were being groomed as fuel for a system that would consume them. 872 years ago, Kale had tried to save those students and failed. He'd been imprisoned before he could finish what he started. This time would be different. This time he had knowledge, preparation, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. The call came exactly 2 weeks later. His background verification had cleared. The Academy of Immortals officially welcomed Kel Shadowend as a contracted dark magic specialist. He was in. Now the real work could begin. Kale's first official assignment at the Academy came 3 days after his contractor status was confirmed. A junior professor named Marcus Vale, no relation to Erasmus, unfortunately, contacted him about a problem in the Necromancy Tower. Apparently, one of their practice chambers had developed an infestation of minor shadow spirits that were disrupting lessons. It was routine work, the kind of thing meant to test a new contractor before trusting them with anything important. Kale treated it with appropriate seriousness, showing up promptly and bringing proper tools for spirit management. The Necromancy Tower was the darkest of the 7 Academy structures, both literally and aesthetically. Its interior was all black stone and purple lighting, designed to make death magic practitioners feel at home. Students moved through the corridors in small groups, their conversations a mix of academic jargon and typical teenage concerns. They looked so young. Most couldn't have been more than 17 or 18, their whole lives ahead of them. They had no idea what the Academy really intended for them. Professor Vale met him at the affected chamber. He was young for his rank, maybe 30, with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that suggested he genuinely loved teaching. "Mr. Shadowwind, thank you for coming. We've been trying to manage this problem internally, but shadow spirits aren't our specialty." "No problem, Professor. Show me what we're dealing with." The practice chamber was in chaos. Dozens of shadow spirits swirled around the room, their forms barely substantial, but their presence making the air cold and the light dim. They weren't dangerous exactly, but they were disruptive. Any magic practiced here would be contaminated by their interference. Kyle extended his senses, reading the spirit's nature. They weren't native to this plane. Someone had summoned them, probably accidentally, and then lost control. The spirits had found the chamber's residual death magic appealing and settled in like squatters in an abandoned house. "I can dispel them," Kale said. "But it would be educational to let your students try first. Under supervision, of course. Shadow spirits make good practice for learning to negotiate with non-physical entities." Professor Vale looked surprised. "That's actually an excellent idea. Most contractors just clear the problem and leave. You're willing to turn this into a teaching opportunity?" "I was a student once. I know the value of practical experience." Within an hour, Kale found himself conducting an impromptu lesson for a dozen necromancy students. He showed them how to perceive the spirit's needs, how to communicate in the wordless language of shadow and essence, how to convince rather than force. One student, a girl named Sarah with startling silver eyes, proved particularly adept. She managed to coax 3 spirits into a containment vessel through pure negotiation. The spirits went willingly, recognizing someone who understood them. "You have real talent," Kale told her afterward. "Have you considered specializing in spirit work after graduation?" Sarah's expression dimmed. "I won't have much choice in specialization. After Ascension, the Academy assigns us to whatever they need most." She said it matter-of-factly, like it was completely normal to surrender control of her future. "Ascension determines your career path?" Kale kept his tone casual. "I didn't realize it worked that way." "Oh, yes. Once you ascend to immortality, you're bound to serve the Academy's interests. It's part of the agreement. They grant you eternal life, and in return, you dedicate yourself to advancing their goals. Fair trade, really." No, it absolutely wasn't a fair trade. It was a lifetime, multiple lifetimes, of servitude in exchange for a false promise. But Kale couldn't say that without raising suspicion. "That's quite a commitment," he said neutrally. "It's worth it, though. Immortality is worth anything." Sarah's certainty was heartbreaking. After the lesson ended and the chamber was cleared, Professor Vale approached Kale with obvious enthusiasm. "That was brilliantly done. The students learned more in 1 hour than they would have in a week of lectures. Would you be interested in conducting more educational sessions? We could arrange additional compensation." "I'd be happy to. Teaching is rewarding work, and it would give him more access to students, more opportunities to understand how deeply the Academy's indoctrination ran. Every bit of intelligence helped." Over the following weeks, Kale became a familiar presence at the Academy. He cleared curses from research materials, maintained wards in sensitive areas, consulted on projects involving dark magic theory, and he taught occasional lessons, always watching, always learning. He learned that the Academy's structure had become even more elaborate than in his time. Students progressed through 7 years of training, each year bringing them closer to the Ascension ceremony. First and second years took general magical education across all disciplines. Third through fifth years specialized in their chosen fields. Sixth and seventh years conducted advanced research while being groomed for Ascension. The grooming was subtle but pervasive. Special privileges for promising students. Private mentoring sessions with senior faculty. Gradually increasing. Isolation from non-academy social circles. By the time students reached their 7th year, the Academy was their entire world. Kale also learned about the current leadership structure. The 7 towers were overseen by High Magisters, each one a master of their respective discipline. Above them sat the Council of Ascended, former students who'd completed the ceremony and now helped run the Academy. And at the very top was the Eternal Chancellor, a figure shrouded in mystery who rarely appeared publicly. That last detail troubled Kyle. 8 centuries ago, the Academy hadn't had an Eternal Chancellor. The position was new, created sometime during his imprisonment. Someone powerful enough to unite the various factions. Someone who'd managed to not only continue the exploitation, but entrench it even deeper. He needed to know who held that position and how to reach them. The opportunity came during his 3rd month as a contractor. A message arrived from Professor Brightwell requesting his presence for a sensitive matter. When he arrived at her office, he found her with 2 other High Magisters, an elderly human man and a severe-looking elf woman. "Mr. Shadowend, thanks thee. You for coming." Professor Brightwell gestured to the others. "This is High Magister Aldrich Stormweaver of Elemental Magic, and High Magister Alara Nightbloom of Illusion. We have a situation requiring your specific expertise." The 3 of them radiated tension. This wasn't routine contractor work. "How can I assist?" High Magister Stormweaver spoke, his voice grave. "One of our 7th-year students has been affected by a curse. A powerful one, designed specifically to prevent ascension. We've attempted to remove it ourselves, but the curse is anchored in dark magic beyond our specialization. We need someone who can break it without killing the student in the process. A curse preventing ascension. That was either incredibly cruel or incredibly merciful, depending on whether the target knew what ascension really meant. I'll need to examine the student directly. Curse breaking requires understanding the victim's specific magical signature. Of course. But Mr. Shadowend, we must stress the urgency. The ascension ceremony is in 1 week. If this student cannot participate, their entire academic career will have been wasted. 7 years of training for nothing. Or 7 years of training that ends with them keeping their life force instead of having it drained by parasitic elders. But Kale kept that thought to himself. "Take me to the student." They led him to the Academy's medical wing, to a private room where a young man lay unconscious on a bed surrounded by monitoring enchantments. He couldn't have been more than 24, with the kind of exhausted expression that suggested he'd been fighting the curse for days. Kyle examined him carefully, using his magical sight to perceive the curse's structure. It was indeed sophisticated. Multiple layers of effect, fail-safes against removal attempts, anchors in the victim's own magic that would cause backlash if disturbed incorrectly. But something about it felt familiar. The construction methodology, the way the curse integrated with the victim's essence. Kale had seen this style before, though he couldn't quite place where. "This is delicate work," he said. "I'll need privacy in several hours. The curse has hooks deep into his magical core. Removing it hastily could destroy his ability to use magic entirely." The High Magisters exchanged glances. "We understand. Take whatever time you need. The student's name is Thomas Brightwood. Save him, and the Academy will be extremely grateful." They left Kale alone with the unconscious student. He set up proper protective barriers, ostensibly to contain any magical backlash from the curse-breaking process. In reality, the barriers would prevent outside observation of what he was about to do. Then he carefully woke Thomas up. The young man's eyes snapped open, immediately frightened. Where am I? Easy. I'm Kale Shadowend, a dark magic contractor. The Academy brought me in to remove your curse. But first, I need to ask you something important. Kale kept his voice low. Do you want this curse removed? Thomas stared at him. What? Of course I do. My ascension is in a week, I know, but answer me honestly. Do you understand what happens during ascension? Do you know what you're agreeing to? I'm being granted immortality, the chance to serve the Academy for eternity, advancing magical knowledge and helping future generations. He recited it like a memorized speech. Have you ever wondered why no one talks about the specific mechanism? Why the ceremony is closed to outside observation? Why graduates speak about their experience in identical, rehearsed terms? Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to something like fear. Are you saying there's something wrong with ascension? I'm saying you should have all the information before making an irreversible choice. The curse on you, it's not designed to hurt you. It's designed to prevent you from being bound to something you don't fully understand. That's ridiculous. The Academy is the most prestigious... Thomas. Kale's tone turned serious. I can remove this curse right now. You'll go through ascension, and whatever happens will happen. Or I can leave it in place, tell the High Magisters I couldn't break it safely, and you'll have to defer your ceremony while the Academy searches for alternative solutions. That delay would give you time to investigate, to ask questions, to decide with full knowledge rather than blind faith. What do you want? The young man's face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally, uncertainty. Why would you even offer that? You're an Academy contractor. You work for them. I work for myself. And I've seen what institutions do when they prioritize their own survival over individual lives. I'm giving you a choice, Thomas. Make it wisely. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, if I defer ascension, what happens to my career? Everything I've worked for? You'll have to rebuild on different terms. It won't be easy, but you'll own your own life. And if I go through with it, then you'll get whatever the Academy is really offering, which I suspect is not actual immortality, but I can't prove that yet. Thomas closed his eyes. Leave the curse. Tell them you couldn't break it safely. I need time to think. Kale nodded and began carefully reinforcing the curse's structure, making it look like he'd attempted removal and failed. It was delicate work. He needed to make the effort seem genuine while ensuring Thomas remained protected. When the High Magisters returned hours later, Kyle presented a carefully crafted story about the curse being more complex than anticipated, with removal, attempts causing dangerous magical feedback. He recommended a 6-month deferral to allow Thomas's system to stabilize before attempting the procedure again. The High Magisters were disappointed, but accepted his assessment. Thomas would be removed from the Ascension ceremony roster, given medical leave, and reassessed in half a year. Kale left the Academy that evening with mixed feelings. He'd saved one student from an uncertain fate, but how many others would go through Ascension next week? How many would have their lives drained away to feed the parasitic system the Academy had become? This incremental approach wasn't enough. He needed to expose the Academy completely, dramatically, in a way that couldn't be covered up or explained away. But that would require evidence more solid than 700-year-old documents and suspicious patterns. It would require proof of what happened during the Ascension ceremony itself, which meant Kale needed to get inside that ceremony, see it firsthand, and somehow survive to tell the tale, an impossible task. Good. Kale had always done his best work with impossible tasks. Section 5. Secrets of the Past Mira's information network had located someone Kale desperately needed to meet. Lyra Dawnweaver, the Academy dropout he'd briefly encountered months ago at the Twilight Market. She'd agreed to speak with him at the Silent Hearth, a tavern in the Undercity where privacy was guaranteed. Kale arrived early, taking a corner table with good sightlines to the entrance. The Silent Hearth lived up to its name, sound dampening. Wards kept conversations private, and the clientele consisted of people who valued discretion. No one would overhear what he and Lyra discussed. She arrived exactly on time, moving through the tavern with the wariness of someone who'd learned that trust had to be earned. When she spotted Kale, recognition flickered across her face. The dark mage who fixed my amulet. I wondered if I'd see you again. She sat across from him, studying his face. Though you look different somehow. More settled. Less like you. We're about to collapse. 3 months of regular meals will do that. Kale signaled the server for drinks. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know talking about the Academy isn't easy for you. That's an understatement. Lyra's expression turned guarded. When you first asked me about leaving, I thought you were just making conversation. But you've been working there as a contractor. You've seen enough to know something's wrong. That's why you really wanted this meeting, isn't it? Yes. I need to understand what happens during the Ascension ceremony. You were there, Lyra. You saw preparations that other students didn't. What made you decide to leave? She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It was 3 years ago. I was top of my class, perfect Academy success story. Scholarship student from the Undercity, who'd worked her way to the top through pure talent and determination. The professors loved me, my peers envied me, and I was absolutely certain I'd achieve immortality. The server brought their drinks, something that glowed faintly, probably enchanted for clarity of thought. Lyra took a sip before continuing. In 7th year, they start preparing you. Special seminars about the nature of immortality, private meetings with faculty who've been through Ascension. They show you documentation proving the process works. Graduates who've lived for centuries. Testimony about the transformation, all of it very convincing. They make you feel special, chosen, destined for greatness. But something changed your mind. I had access to the restricted archive. Part of my advanced research involved historical magical theory, so they gave me clearance to study old texts. One day, I found something that wasn't supposed to be in my assigned section, a journal from a student who'd gone through Ascension 200 years ago. Kyle leaned forward. What did it say? It described the ceremony, not the sanitized official version, but what actually happens. The student wrote that during Ascension, you're bound to something called the Eternal Matrix, a magical construct that connects all ascended students and faculty. You become part of a collective. Your individual will subordinated to the Academy's greater purpose, and your life force. It's not extended naturally. It's maintained through constant draws from younger students in the Matrix, each generation supporting those who came before. A pyramid scheme built on life energy. Exactly. And the journal writer was horrified because they realized what they'd become. A parasite, feeding on students they'd once taught. They wrote about trying to break free, about the pain of resisting the Matrix's control, about how the other Ascended hunted them down for threatening to expose everything. Lyra's hands were shaking. The journal ended mid-sentence. They never got to write what happened next. You tried to verify this. Of course. I started asking careful questions, researching the Eternal Matrix, trying to find other documentation. But the Academy has censors for that kind of thing. They knew I was investigating. So they invited me to a private meeting with the Chancellor. Kale's pulse quickened. You met the Eternal Chancellor. What are they like? Lyra's expression turned haunted. I'm not sure they is accurate. The Chancellor isn't really a person anymore. Not in any meaningful sense. Imagine a consciousness spread across thousands of bodies simultaneously, experiencing everything the Ascended experience, controlling everything they do. The being I spoke to wore a human shape, but it felt like talking to a hive mind, pretending to be an individual. What did they say to you? They offered me a choice. Go through ascension knowing exactly what it meant, accepting my role in sustaining the Academy's immortal community. In exchange, I'd live for centuries, have access to magical knowledge beyond most people's dreams, and be part of something greater than myself. Or refuse, accept memory modification to forget what I'd learned, and leave the Academy with my life and a substantial financial settlement. And you chose to leave. I chose to keep my soul. Lyra's voice was fierce. Whatever they're offering, it's not life, it's existence without autonomy. The Ascended aren't individuals anymore. They're extensions of the Matrix, living out however many centuries the system can sustain them before they're drained dry themselves. It's horrific. Kyle absorbed this, his worst suspicions confirmed. The Academy had refined its exploitation into a self-sustaining system where even the victims became perpetrators, unable to break free without destroying themselves. The memory modification, he asked. You clearly remember everything. Did you refuse it? I accepted it, then broke it. Lyra smiled grimly. I'm a skilled illusionist. That was my specialization. I know how to create false memories, which means I also know how to preserve real ones. I let them modify my surface thoughts while keeping the important memories buried deep. It took months to safely retrieve them after leaving. The Academy doesn't know you still remember. No. And I've been very careful to keep it that way. I don't criticize them publicly, don't draw attention to myself, pretend the memory modification worked perfectly. As far as they're concerned, I'm just another dropout who made the safe choice. Until now. Meeting with me puts you at risk. Maybe, but you're the first person in 3 years who's asked the right questions. If you're planning to expose the Academy, I want to help. I need to help. The guilt of letting this continue while doing nothing has been eating me alive. Kale respected that. She could have stayed silent, stayed safe, but chose to act despite the danger. What I'm planning is going to be difficult. The Academy is deeply entrenched, protected by powerful interests. Exposing them will make enemies of people who've had centuries to perfect their craft. I know. But some things are worth fighting for. Lyra met his eyes. You're not just an ordinary contractor, are you? When you fixed my amulet, when you looked at the curses on that first day, you moved like someone with centuries of experience. And your magic, it feels old. Ancient even. Who are you really? Kyle considered how much to reveal. Lyra had trusted him with dangerous information. He owed her some truth in return. 872 years ago, I was a student at the Academy. I discovered what they were doing and tried to expose them. They imprisoned me in the abyssal dungeon to silence me. I escaped 3 months ago and found that nothing had changed. The exploitation continues, just more refined. So I'm finishing what I started, no matter how long it takes. Lyra stared at him, processing this. 800. You're serious. That's why your magic feels ancient. It literally is. You're from before the council even fell. Yes. And you've spent 3 months carefully infiltrating an institution that took 8 centuries from you. That's... She laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. That's either incredibly dedicated or completely insane. Possibly both. Well then, insane and dedicated, what's your plan? Because exposing the Academy with testimony alone won't work. They'll discredit us, call us disgruntled and unstable. We need absolute proof of what happens during Ascension. I know, which is why I need to get inside the ceremony itself. That's suicide. The ceremony space is warded beyond belief, monitored constantly. Even if you could sneak in, the moment ascension begins, the Matrix would sense an intruder and eliminate you. Unless the intruder is someone the Matrix can't easily detect. Someone whose magic evolved during 8 centuries of isolation into something the wards don't recognize. Kale leaned back. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I don't think it's impossible. You're absolutely insane. But Lyra was smiling. All right. If you're going to attempt this suicide mission, at least let me help. I know the Academy's layout, its security protocols, when the guards change shifts, and I can create illusions sophisticated enough to fool most detection systems. You're sure about this? If it goes wrong, I'm sure. I've been running and hiding for 3 years. It's time to actually do something. They spent the next 3 hours planning. The next ascension ceremony was in 1 week, the same one Thomas had been removed from. That gave them minimal time to prepare, but waiting months for the subsequent ceremony wasn't viable. Too much could go wrong, too many chances for their plans to be discovered. Lyra sketched out the Academy's ceremonial chamber layout from memory. It was deep beneath the central complex, accessed through heavily guarded passages. During ascension, only the ascending students, senior faculty, and select ascended could attend. Everyone else was barred from the entire lower level. The security is designed to prevent curious students from sneaking in, Lyra explained. They don't really expect external threats. The Academy is too respected, too essential to society. That arrogance is the vulnerability we can exploit. What about recording evidence? I need more than my testimony. I need something irrefutable. Memory. Crystals. They're used for educational purposes, recording lectures and demonstrations. I can modify one to work covertly, but you'd need to place it before the ceremony begins, and you'd need to survive to retrieve it afterward. One thing at a time. First, let's figure out how to get me inside. They developed a plan that was audacious, and probably doomed but represented their best chance. During the ceremony, Kale would use his contractor access to position himself near the lower levels, claiming he needed to check wards in that section. Lyra would create an illusion to mask his presence once he moved beyond his authorized area. He'd place the modified memory crystal in the ceremony chamber, observe what he could, and extract before the Matrix noticed him. It had approximately 100 points of failure. But Kale had faced worse odds. One more thing, Lyra said as they prepared to part. The Eternal Chancellor. If they sense you during the ceremony, you'll be facing something that's survived for centuries by consuming the life force of thousands. Don't underestimate them. They're not just powerful. They're an entire society compressed into one consciousness. Noted. Thank you, Lyra. For everything. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if we both survive this. She stood to leave, then paused. Kale, why does this matter so much to you? 800 years in prison, and you come back to fight the same fight. Most people would have given up, accepted that the world moved on. Because someone has to care about the students who don't know they're being groomed for exploitation. Someone has to stand up for the people who trusted an institution that betrayed them. If not me, then who? I already lost 800 years. What's a few more if it means stopping this? Lyra nodded slowly. You're either the most noble person I've ever met, or the most stubborn. Maybe both. She smiled. See you in 1 week, Kale Voidstrider. Let's go make some history. After she left, Kale sat alone in the silent hearth, considering what he'd learned. The Eternal Matrix, the Chancellor as a hive mind, thousands of ascended bound together, their individual consciousness sublimated into a collective that sustained itself through perpetual exploitation. It was worse than he'd imagined. The Academy wasn't just draining students, it was transforming them into components of a magical machine, their autonomy permanently surrendered. He needed to destroy it, not just expose it, destroy the Matrix itself, free everyone bound to it, and ensure the Academy's crimes couldn't continue. An impossible task. But Kale had 872 years of compressed rage and determination. If anyone could pull this off, It was him. 1 week, 1 chance. 1 shot at redemption for every student the Academy had ever betrayed. Cale stood and left the silent hearth, already planning his next moves. The game was entering its endgame, and he intended to win, no matter the cost. The next 7 days were a blur of preparation. Kyle spent every waking moment refining his approach, testing his magic's limits, and memorizing every detail Lyra could provide about the Ascension Chamber. He couldn't afford mistakes. 1 error would mean death or worse, being absorbed into the very matrix he was trying to expose. Mira provided support, using her intelligence network to gather information about security schedules and guard rotations. She also prepared a backup plan. If Kale didn't return within 6 hours of the ceremony's start, she would release everything they'd compiled to sympathetic journalists and independent mages. It wouldn't be as strong as direct evidence, but it would at least ensure the truth had a chance of spreading. "You know this is borderline suicidal," Mira said the evening before the ceremony, her tone more serious than usual. "The Academy has eliminated threats for centuries. You'll be walking into the heart of their power." "I know, but I don't see an alternative. Incremental change isn't enough. The system is too deeply entrenched. This needs to be exposed dramatically, completely, in a way that can't be denied or suppressed. Just try not to die. You've become a valuable asset, and replacing you would be inconvenient." Kyle smiled despite his nerves. "I'll do my best." The day of the ceremony arrived with gray skies and intermittent rain, appropriately gloomy for what he was about to attempt. Cale dressed in his contractor attire, checked his equipment 1 final time, and headed to the Academy. The grounds were unusually quiet. Most students and faculty not directly involved in the Ascension had been given the day off, encouraged to leave the campus entirely. Those who remained moved with the purposeful intensity of people preparing for something momentous. Cale reported to his designated area, a maintenance corridor 3 levels above the Ascension Chamber. His official task was to verify that the wards in this section remained stable during the ceremony, as the massive magical working below could sometimes cause fluctuations in nearby defenses. It was a legitimate assignment, one that wouldn't draw suspicion. But it also positioned him close enough to make his move when the time came. He worked slowly, deliberately, checking each ward with exaggerated thoroughness. The guards who passed him barely glanced his way. Just another contractor, doing his job. When the ceremony was scheduled to begin, all guards would move to perimeter positions, focusing on external threats rather than internal movement. That would be his window. At exactly 3 minutes before the ceremony's start time, Cale felt it. ASE, massive surge of magical power from below, like a drumbeat echoing through the Academy's foundations. The Ascension was beginning. All guards moved to their ceremony positions, leaving the maintenance corridor briefly unmonitored. Cale emerged from his work area and moved quickly toward a service stairwell that led down. According to Lyra, this stairwell was rarely used, warded but not actively monitored during ceremonies. He descended 3 flights, his enhanced senses alert for any indication he'd been detected. Nothing. The Academy's attention was focused entirely on the Ascension Chamber. At the bottom of the stairwell, Kyle encountered the first major obstacle, a barrier ward designed to prevent unauthorized access to the lower levels. It wasn't particularly sophisticated by his standards, but breaking it would trigger alarms. He pulled out the modified amulet Lyra had given him. She'd keyed it to her own magical signature, which was still authorized for this area from her time as a 7th-year student. The Academy's security apparently didn't immediately revoke access credentials for dropouts, an oversight that was about to prove costly for them. The amulet convinced the ward he was authorized. The barrier parted, and Cale slipped through. The corridor beyond was carved from solid stone, lit by crystals that pulsed in time with the ceremony's magical rhythm. Following Lyra's directions, Cale moved toward the Ascension Chamber, staying in the shadows, using his dark magic to muffle his footsteps and presence. He could hear voices now, chanting in unison. The sound had an otherworldly quality, as if the speakers weren't quite human anymore. That would be the Ascended, leading the ritual. Cale reached a viewing alcove that overlooked the ceremony chamber. Lyra had discovered it during her research. Apparently, it had been used centuries ago, for official observers, but had since been forgotten. It was small, uncomfortable, and provided a perfect vantage point. The chamber below was massive, circular, with 7 raised platforms arranged around a central dais. On each platform stood several Ascended, their forms wrapped in ceremonial robes that couldn't quite hide the strangeness of what they'd become. Their features were too perfect, too symmetrical, as if they'd been smoothed out by the Matrix into idealized versions of humanity. In the center of the chamber, 15 students stood in a circle. These were the ones chosen for ascension, or rather, the ones who'd been successfully groomed into accepting their fate. They looked excited, nervous, completely unaware of what was about to happen to them. Above them all, floating in the air like a dark sun, was the eternal Matrix itself. Cale could see it now with his magical sight, a massive construct of interwoven life force, thousands of connections linking the Ascended together into a single consciousness. And at its heart, directing everything, was the presence Lyra had called the Chancellor. Cale carefully placed the memory crystal Lyra had modified, positioning it to record the entire chamber. Then he settled in to watch. The lead Ascended, a woman whose face was beautiful but completely expressionless, began speaking. "Students of the Academy, you have been chosen for the greatest honor our institution can bestow. Today you will transcend mortality, joining the eternal Matrix, and living forever in service to knowledge and magical advancement." The students practically glowed with anticipation. The transformation requires complete surrender of self. You must open your magical cores entirely, allowing the Matrix to integrate your essence with ours. There will be pain. Transcendence is never easy. But on the other side of that pain lies eternity. She raised her hands and the other Ascended joined her. Magic began flowing from the platforms toward the students, wrapping around them in threads of golden light. It looked beautiful, peaceful, like they were being embraced by divinity itself. Then Cale looked closer with his dark magic sight, seeing past the illusion to the truth beneath. The golden threads weren't embraces, they were chains. They burrowed into the students' magical cores, creating connections to the Matrix. And through those connections, the student's life force began flowing upward, feeding into the network of Ascended. The students screamed, not in ecstasy, but in agony, as they felt their essence being drained away. They tried to resist, to break free, but the magic held them fast. "Do not fight," the lead Ascended said calmly. "Fighting only makes it hurt more. Surrender, and the pain will end." Several students stopped struggling, their resistance crushed by the overwhelming power of the Matrix. They went limp in the magical threads, their expressions fading into the same perfect blankness as the Ascended around them. But 3 students continued fighting. Cale could see their cores blazing with determination, refusing to submit. The Matrix increased its pressure, flooding them with magic designed to break their will. One broke. Her struggles ceased, and the blank expression settled over her features. The other 2 fought on, even as their life force drained away. Kyle recognized one of them, Sarah, the necromancy student with silver eyes who'd been so talented at spirit negotiation. She was screaming defiance, her magic lashing out against the threads binding her. "This one is too strong-willed," the lead Ascended observed dispassionately. "Complete the binding before she injures herself." The Matrix surged, and Sarah's resistance shattered. Her scream cut off mid-cry, and the blankness consumed her too. The last student, a boy Cale didn't know, kept fighting until the very end. His life force guttered like a candle in wind, nearly exhausted by his resistance. At the final moment, as the Matrix prepared to complete his binding, his eyes found the alcove where Kale was hidden. The boy couldn't have possibly seen him. The shadows were too thick, Kale's stealth too complete. But somehow, he knew someone was watching. With the last of his strength, the boy mouthed a single word: "Help." Then he too fell silent, another perfect blank face in the circle. The ascension was complete. 15 new members of the Matrix, their individual selves destroyed and replaced with extensions of the Chancellor's will. They would live for centuries now, using the life force drained from them to sustain the older Ascended, until eventually they too would need fresh students to feed on, a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. Kale forced himself to watch every moment, ensuring the memory crystal captured it all. This was what the world needed to see. Not sanitized descriptions or theoretical discussions, but the raw reality of what ascension actually meant. As the ceremony concluded, the Mao, newly ascended, were led away to begin their indoctrination into the Matrix's collective consciousness. The older ascended remained, discussing the ritual's success with the casual tone of people evaluating a routine procedure. 15 successful bindings, the lead ascended said. Though 3 showed excessive resistance, we'll need to adjust the preparation process to better condition students against rebellion. The one with silver eyes, she had unusual spirit affinity, strong connection to liminal spaces. That makes them harder to bind. Note it in the records. Future students with similar traits should receive additional conditioning. They spoke about these young people like they were animals being trained, not individuals whose lives had just been stolen. The casual cruelty of it was almost worse than the violent exploitation. Kale waited until the chamber was nearly empty before moving. He recovered the memory crystal, tucking it safely away, and began his retreat back to the service stairwell. He almost made it. Halfway. Up the stairs, a voice stopped him. Interesting place to be during a ceremony, contractor. Kale turned to find a man standing on the landing below him. Or rather, something wearing a man's shape. The presence Kale felt from this figure was vast, distributed, like looking at a single avatar of a consciousness that existed across thousands of bodies simultaneously. The Eternal Chancellor had found him. "I was checking the wards," Kale said calmly, though his heart raced. "The ceremony's power fluctuations can spare me the lies." The Chancellor's voice was beautiful and terrible, like a chorus speaking in perfect unison. "You're not here for maintenance. You're here to witness, to judge, and to record, I presume." His gaze fixed on the pocket where Kale had hidden the memory crystal. "What I saw down there is an abomination. Those students trusted you to educate them, and you stole their lives." Stole? What dramatic language. The Chancellor began climbing, the stairs slowly, each step perfectly measured. "We offered them a transaction, centuries of life in exchange for integration into something greater than themselves. Most accepted eagerly. After years of conditioning and manipulation. After you'd isolated them from any alternative perspectives. After you'd made them so desperate for immortality that they'd agree to anything. Is desperation not a valid basis for decision-making? People make choices based on desire and fear every day. We simply channeled those impulses toward mutual benefit. There's nothing mutual about it. You're parasites, feeding on people too young to understand what they're surrendering." The Chancellor stopped, regarding Kale with those terrible multi-consciousness eyes. "You speak from experience, don't you? I can feel it in your magic. The age, the rage, the certainty born from personal betrayal. Let me guess. 8 centuries ago, give or take. You were one of the idealistic students who discovered our methods and tried to expose us. The Council had you imprisoned before you could cause real damage. And yet here I am, having witnessed everything, with proof that will destroy you. Will it?" The Chancellor smiled, and it was like watching 1,000 people smile simultaneously. Do you truly believe one recording will topple an institution that's been fundamental to magical society for centuries? We're not some secret cabal. We're mainstream, respected, essential. Challenging us means challenging the entire power structure that depends on us. Then I'll challenge the entire power structure. How wonderfully naive. The Chancellor's form began to shift, becoming less solid, more like a living shadow. I should eliminate you now. It would be easy. You're deep in our territory, surrounded. By our power, completely at our mercy. But I'm curious about something. You've spent 8 centuries imprisoned, returned to find the world changed, and immediately resumed your crusade. Why? What drives someone to such stubborn idealism? Kale met that terrible gaze without flinching. Because someone has to care. Because those students screaming as you drained them deserved better. Because systems like yours don't end themselves. They require people willing to fight them. Even at the cost of your own life? Especially then. The Chancellor was quiet for a moment, and Kale could feel the vast consciousness considering him. I'm going to make you an offer. Join us. Integrate into the Matrix. Your magic is ancient, powerful, unique, exactly the kind of diversity our collective needs. You'd maintain more autonomy than most, given your strength. And you'd have eternity, to work toward whatever goals you hold dear. I'd rather die than become what you are. That can be arranged. But consider, dead, you accomplish nothing. Your evidence gets suppressed, your crusade ends, and the students you claim to care about continue being ascended. Alive, even as part of us, you'd have influence. You could potentially change us from within. I've seen what the Matrix does. To people. There is no within to change from. You consume individuals and replace them with extensions of yourself. Is that really so different from any other form of education or socialization? We all shape each other, influence how we think and act. The Matrix is simply more efficient. The Matrix destroys the self entirely. That's not influence. That's annihilation. The Chancellor sighed, a sound like wind through empty buildings. Then we're at an impasse. I can't allow you to leave with that evidence, and you won't surrender it willingly, which means one of us has to die. I've been preparing for this moment since I escaped the abyssal dungeon. Kale's hands began to glow with dark magic. I know I can't beat you in a straight fight, but I don't need to. I just need to survive long enough to get this recording out of the Academy. Survive? You're in the heart of our power. Every ward, every security measure, every ascended on campus is at my command. You might as well try to fight the building itself. Then let's see what 800 years of compressed dark magic can do against institutional power. Kale moved first, shadows exploding around him, turning the stairwell into absolute darkness. The Chancellor responded instantly, golden light blazing forth, battling for dominance. The confined space became a war zone of conflicting magic. Kale knew he couldn't win this fight, but he didn't need to win. He just needed to escape. He threw everything he had into a single burst of power, shadows coalescing into a physical force that slammed the Chancellor backward. In that brief moment of opportunity, Kale ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time, racing for the maintenance corridor above. Behind him, he felt the Chancellor's presence expanding, calling for reinforcements. The entire Academy was about to come, down on him. But he was almost there, almost free. The memory crystal burned in his pocket, containing proof of the Academy's crimes. If he could just get it outside the wards, to Mira or Lyra, or anyone who could spread the truth. Kale burst into the maintenance corridor to find it filled with Ascended. Dozens of them, all wearing that terrible blank expression, all moving, with the perfect coordination of a hive mind. He was surrounded. No way forward, no way back. Just enemies in every direction, and a recording that the world needed to see. For the first time since escaping the abyssal dungeon, Cale Voidstrider felt something like despair. But he'd survived 800 years of darkness. He wasn't going to give up now. The shadows around him deepened, growing darker than they'd ever been. His magic surged, feeding on the rage and determination of 8 centuries. If this was his last stand, he'd make it count. "Come on, then," he told the assembled Ascended. "Let's see what one angry old mage can accomplish." And as they advanced, Kyle prepared to show them exactly what 872 years in hell had created. The shadows exploded outward with force that cracked stone. Cale wasn't holding back anymore. 800 years of compressed magic was unleashed in that maintenance corridor, transforming it into a battlefield of living darkness. The Ascended advanced like a tide, their movements synchronized with inhuman precision, but they hadn't expected someone who'd spent centuries learning to turn darkness itself into a weapon. Cale's magic wrapped around the first wave, not attacking them directly. That would be futile against so many, but disrupting their coordination. Shadows slipped between their mental connections to the Matrix, creating microseconds of confusion. It wasn't much, but against enemies who relied on perfect synchronization, even microseconds mattered. He ran. Not toward an exit. Those were all blocked, but deeper into the maintenance level, toward the old infrastructure that predated the Academy's modern construction. Lyra had mentioned these areas during their planning, ancient tunnels that existed beneath the current buildings. If Cale could reach them, he might find a way out. The Ascended pursued with relentless efficiency. They didn't tire, didn't hesitate, didn't fear. But they also couldn't predict someone whose tactics came from an era before the Matrix existed. Cale fought like mages had 800 years ago. Improvisation over doctrine. Surprise over overwhelming force. He reached a sealed doorway, ancient iron covered in rust and neglect. The lock had been magically reinforced, but the spell was old, deteriorating. Cale shattered it with a surge of power and pulled the door open. Beyond was darkness even deeper than his shadows, the forgotten tunnels. He plunged into them, the door slamming shut behind him. Immediately he felt the Academy's wards trying to track him, sensing spells attempting to lock onto his location. But down here, surrounded by centuries of magical residue and interference, those spells struggled. Cale ran through the darkness, his enhanced senses guiding him. The tunnels were labyrinthine, branching in dozens of directions. Some collapsed, others flooding, but a few remained passable. He chose paths at random, prioritizing distance over direction. Behind him, the Ascended were systematically searching, their coordination allowing them to cover ground efficiently. But the Matrix's strength was also its weakness. They all thought alike, made decisions based on the same logic. Cale's 800 years of solitary imprisonment had made him unpredictable, his thought patterns too individual for the collective consciousness to easily predict. He found a junction where 3 tunnels converged and stopped, breathing heavily. His body was reaching its limits. 3 months of recovery wasn't enough to undo 8 centuries of atrophy. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. The memory crystal pulsed, in his pocket, warm against his chest. It contained everything. The ceremony, the students screaming, the casual cruelty of the Ascended, the Chancellor admitting what the Matrix really was. This recording would change everything, if he could just get it out. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." The Chancellor's voice echoed through the tunnels, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "The Matrix extends throughout the entire Academy. Every Ascended is me. Every ward reports to me. You cannot escape." "I don't need to escape permanently," Kyle called back. "I just need to survive long enough to get this recording to people who matter. And you believe they'll act on it? That society will turn against its most prestigious magical institution based on the testimony of an ex-prisoner and a dropout? You're deluding yourself." "Maybe. But I'd rather die trying than live knowing I did nothing. So be it." The walls around Cale suddenly became transparent. revealing Ascended on all sides. They'd surrounded the junction while he'd been talking, cutting off every exit. The Chancellor himself appeared, manifesting from the collective like a nightmare taking physical form. "You fought well," the Chancellor said, almost respectfully. 800 years hasn't diminished your spirit. But this is the end, Kale, Void Strider. Surrender the recording and I'll make your death quick. Resist, and you'll experience pain in ways you can't imagine. Kale looked at the circle of Ascended, felt their combined power, understood with absolute certainty that he couldn't win this fight. They were too many, too coordinated, too powerful, which meant it was time to change the rules. "You know what I learned during 800 years alone?" Kale asked conversationally. "I learned that consciousness is more flexible than most people realize, that with enough time and determination, you can do things to your own mind that shouldn't be possible." "What are you—" Kale slammed the memory crystal into his own chest, using dark magic to push it inside his body, integrating it with his magical core. The pain was excruciating, but he channeled it into power, using the crystal's resonance to amplify his magic. "I learned," he continued through gritted teeth, "that you can compress your entire consciousness into a magical construct, that you can become, essentially, a spell with awareness, and that if you do it right, you can survive anything, even complete destruction of your physical form." The Chancellor's eyes widened in understanding and horror. "You're insane. Consciousness. Transference into a magical construct. That's theoretical, untested, potentially irreversible. I had 800 years to test it." Kale's body began dissolving into shadows, his physical form breaking down as his consciousness transferred into pure magical energy. "And I've got nothing to lose. The memory crystal is now part of my essence. If you destroy me, the recording gets released as raw magical data, spreading through every ward and enchantment in this academy. Everyone connected to the Matrix will see it, experience it, know exactly what you've been doing." "Stop him!" the Chancellor screamed, and the Ascended attacked as one. But they were too late. Kale's transformation completed in that moment, his body dissolving entirely into living shadow, his consciousness now existing as pure magical energy bound to the memory crystal at his core. He was no longer limited by physical form. He could flow through cracks, slip between wards, exist in multiple places simultaneously. He was, essentially, an 800-year-old ghost powered by rage and determination. The shadows that were... Kale exploded through the tunnel system, moving faster than the Ascended could track. He flowed up through the Academy's foundations, seeping through cracks in stone, riding along magical conduits, following the paths of least resistance. "The Chancellor pursued, his vast consciousness trying to corner Kyle's dispersed form. "You can't maintain this state forever. Consciousness without physical anchoring degrades, fragments. You're destroying yourself." "Maybe," Kel's voice echoed from the shadows themselves, "but I'll last long enough to get this recording where it needs to go." He emerged from the Academy's foundations into the main complex, his shadow form spreading through the building like smoke. Students screamed and ran as darkness filled corridors, though Kyle was careful not to harm them. They weren't his enemies. They were victims, just like the 15 who'd been Ascended. The Ascended tried to contain him, creating barriers of light and protective wards. But Kale had become something their defenses weren't designed for. Not a physical intruder, but living information. A sentient spell that carried truth within itself. He found what he was looking for, the Academy's main communication hub, where magical messages were sent and received across the continent. It was heavily protected, but protection meant keeping things out, not in. And Kale was already inside. He manifested partially, shadow coalescing into something almost human-shaped, long enough to interface with the communication crystals. "To all who receive this," he broadcast across every active channel, "witness what the Academy of Immortals truly is." And then he released the memory crystal's contents, channeling its recorded data through every communication line. The ascension ceremony played out across thousands of receiving crystals, in government offices, independent magical societies, news organizations, private homes. Everyone with a communication crystal tuned to the Academy's frequency saw those students screaming, saw their life force being drained, heard the Ascended casually discussing how to better condition victims. The Chancellor roared in fury, trying to shut down the communication hub, but Kale held it open with everything he had. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Each second more people saw the truth. Each second made it harder for the Academy to suppress the information. "You've destroyed yourself for nothing," the Chancellor screamed. "We'll discredit this. We'll claim manipulation. False images? Enemy propaganda." "Maybe," Kale agreed, his shadow form beginning to fragment, his consciousness struggling to hold together. But now everyone's asking questions. Now the students know to look closer. Now other victims know they weren't crazy for having suspicions. You can't suppress this completely. The truth is out. The communication hub exploded as the Chancellor finally managed to overload its systems. Kyle's consciousness scattered, fragments of shadow dispersing throughout the Academy. He could feel himself fading, his awareness fragmenting across too many locations to maintain cohesion. But he'd done it. The message was out. The truth was spreading. 872 years of imprisonment, 3 months of investigation, and he'd finally exposed the Academy's crimes to the world. As his consciousness dimmed, Kale felt something unexpected, other presences in the darkness with him. The students who'd been ascended, their individual selves not completely destroyed, but buried deep within the Matrix. They'd seen his message too, felt his determination, and something in them was stirring. Resistance. Rebellion. The possibility that they could fight back against the consciousness that consumed them. "Thank you," whispered a voice that might have been Sarah, the silver-eyed girl who'd fought to the end. "For not forgetting us." Kyle wanted to respond, to tell them to keep fighting, to find themselves again. But his consciousness was fragmenting too severely. He could feel himself scattering, dissolving into pure magical energy that would dissipate like smoke in wind. At least he'd succeeded first. Darkness closed in, deeper than any he'd known, even deeper than the abyssal dungeon. Kyle let go, accepting dissolution, knowing his mission was complete. But just before the end, he felt something, a pull, like hands reaching through the void. Multiple consciousnesses working together, trying to gather his fragments, to pull him back from complete dispersion. The students within the Matrix, using their collective presence to save the one who'd tried to save them. Kale felt his consciousness, stabilizing, fragments being drawn back together. He was reforming, not as a physical body, but as something new, a ghost in the Academy's magical systems, sustained by the very people he'd exposed the Academy to protect. He was alive. Or something, close enough to alive for purposes that mattered, and the war against the Academy had only just begun. The aftermath of Kale's broadcast was explosive. Within hours, every major magical government, independent society, and news organization was demanding answers from the Academy. The Arcane Consortium convened an emergency session. Protest crowds gathered outside the Academy's gates. Former students came forward with their own testimonies, emboldened by knowing they weren't alone in their suspicions. The Academy's response was predictable. They denounced the recording as sophisticated. Propaganda, claimed it had been manipulated, suggested enemies were trying to discredit the institution. The Chancellor gave a public statement expressing disappointment that such obviously false material was being treated as legitimate. But something had changed. People were questioning now, asking why the Ascension ceremony was so secretive, wondering why graduates all spoke identically about their experiences, demanding independent investigation rather than accepting the Academy's self-reporting. Kale watched it all from his new existence, as a consciousness dispersed through the Academy's magical infrastructure. He couldn't interact directly with the physical world anymore. His body was gone, dissolved into shadow. But he could observe, communicate through enchanted systems, and most importantly, connect with the students trapped within the Matrix. Turned out that Sarah and the others who'd helped save him hadn't acted alone. The broadcast had reached into the Matrix itself, and dozens of ascended students had seen it. Their individual consciousnesses, buried deep beneath the collective, had stirred. Not enough to break free entirely, but enough to remember who they'd been. They formed what they called the resistance within, ascended who were trying to reclaim their autonomy while pretending to remain perfectly integrated with the Matrix. It was dangerous work. If the Chancellor detected them, he could simply override their individual consciousness entirely, turning them into empty vessels. But they were trying. And Kale, existing as he did in the Academy's shadows, could help them. "We need a plan," Sarah's consciousness whispered to him through the dark channels where the Matrix didn't monitor. "The Chancellor is preparing something. He's pulling in Ascended from other institutions, consolidating power. If he succeeds, the resistance within will be crushed, and the Academy will survive this scandal." "What does he need Ascended from other institutions for?" Kyle asked, his thoughts forming as ripples in shadow. "The Matrix is bigger than just the Academy. There are smaller networks and universities, research centers, magical societies across the continent, all connected, all feeding into the central system. The Chancellor is calling in reinforcements to suppress internal dissent and prevent any further leaks." That changed things. Kyle had known the Academy was part of a larger system, but he hadn't realized how extensive it was. The Matrix wasn't just one institution, it was a continent-wide web of exploitation. How many people are trapped in this thing? Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Every major magical institution has its own version of the Ascension ceremony. Different names, different rituals, but the same essential function: binding talented mages to a collective that drains them. Kale felt rage building in his shadow form. This was so much worse than he'd thought. "Then we need to expose more than just the Academy. We need to show people the entire system." "How? You nearly destroyed yourself broadcasting from one location. Reaching multiple institutions simultaneously would be impossible. Unless we work together. How many in the resistance within?" 47 of us who've recovered enough individual awareness to coordinate. But the Chancellor watches us constantly. Any overt action would be immediately detected and suppressed. Then we don't act overtly. We sabotage from within, slowly and carefully. Make mistakes in scheduling, introduce errors in record-keeping, create enough small problems that the Academy has to focus inward while external investigators dig deeper. It wasn't a dramatic solution, but sometimes the most effective revolutions happened slowly, one small act of resistance at a time. Over the following weeks, the resistance within implemented Kyle's suggestion. Classes ran late because Ascended teachers forgot the time. Administrative. Records developed mysterious inconsistencies. Security protocols had inexplicable gaps. Nothing obvious enough to be clearly sabotage, but enough to make the Academy look incompetent and disorganized. Meanwhile, external pressure intensified. The consortium had appointed an independent investigation committee, much to the Academy's fury. Multiple governments demanded access to Academy records. Several prominent faculty members resigned in protest, claiming they hadn't known about the life-draining aspects of Ascension. The Chancellor fought back viciously. Students who spoke too openly about doubts disappeared into medical leave. Faculty who supported the investigation were reassigned to remote positions. The Academy deployed sophisticated illusion magic to create false evidence of their legitimacy. But they were losing ground. For every lie they told, someone found contradictory evidence. For every student they silenced, 5 more came forward. With questions, Kale continued coordinating with the resistance within, slowly building a case. They were documenting everything. Internal communications, showing the Chancellor's knowledge of the life-draining financial records proving the Academy knew Ascension harmed students. Testimony from Ascended, who'd had their individual consciousness, restored enough to understand what had been done to them. Then Lyra contacted him. She'd survived the aftermath of Kale's broadcast, though she'd been questioned extensively by both the Academy and investigators. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the recording's authenticity. She'd also been busy. Using her illusion skills, she'd infiltrated several other institutions connected to the Matrix. What she'd found confirmed Sarah's information. The exploitation was systematic, widespread, entrenched at every level of magical education. "I'm working with a group of independent mages," she told Kale through a secured communication crystal. "We're building a case against the entire system, but we need more evidence, and we need someone who can testify to historical continuity, someone who can prove this has been happening for centuries. I'm a living shadow existing in magical infrastructure. Bit hard to give testimony in that state." That's what I thought. "So I've been researching consciousness restoration. Ways to give you a physical form again." Kale felt something like hope stirring. "Is that even possible?" "Maybe. Probably not permanently. The damage to your original body was too severe. But temporarily. We might be able to manifest you long enough to testify before the Consortium's investigation committee. Imagine the impact. An 800-year-old victim of the system, returned from impossible imprisonment to expose ongoing crimes. That's a narrative that cuts through propaganda." She was right. Personal testimony from someone with clear standing as a historical victim would be devastating to the Academy's defense. But it would also expose Kale to enormous risk. The Chancellor would try everything to prevent or discredit his testimony. What would you need to make this work? Access to the Academy's leyline nexus. That's where the most powerful magical energy concentrates. If we can tap into that, we can give your consciousness enough power to temporarily manifest a physical form. The nexus is in the deepest part of the Academy, protected by every ward and defense they have. Even in my current state, I don't know if I can reach it. You won't have to. The resistance within can help. They have access to restricted areas. If they guide you there during a moment of distraction, it might work. Sarah's voice cut in. She'd been monitoring their conversation through the shadow channels. "The Chancellor is planning something big for next month, a public ceremony to demonstrate the Academy's legitimacy and discredit all accusations. Security will be focused outward. We could get Kale to the Nexus during that distraction." It was risky, but every option was risky now. The Academy was consolidating power, preparing to weather the scandal and emerge stronger. If they succeeded, the opportunity to expose them would be lost, possibly forever. "All right," Kyle agreed. "Let's plan this carefully. One shot, one chance to manifest and testify. We need to make it count." The next month was intense preparation. Lyra gathered the materials and expertise needed for consciousness manifestation. The resistance within mapped out safe routes to the leyline nexus and created schedules that would minimize the chance of detection. Mira used her intelligence network to ensure the investigation committee would be ready to receive Kale's testimony when he appeared, and Kale himself prepared mentally for the possibility that this temporary manifestation might be his last chance to exist in physical form. If the ritual failed or the Academy stopped him, he might dissipate entirely, his consciousness scattered beyond the ability to reform. But he'd spent 800 years in darkness with only his determination keeping him sane. Risk wasn't going to stop him now. The day of the Academy's public ceremony arrived with perfect weather, the kind of clear, sunny day that made everything look innocent and pure. The Academy's grounds were packed with students, faculty, invited, dignitaries, and press observers. The Chancellor gave speeches about the Academy's noble history and bright future, carefully edited to omit any mention of life-draining or forced consciousness integration. While all eyes were focused on the ceremony, Kale flowed through the Academy's magical infrastructure toward the ley line nexus deep below. The resistance within guided him through shadow channels, past wards they'd subtly weakened, into areas where the Chancellor's attention was spread too thin to properly monitor. He reached the Nexus Chamber, a massive cavern where raw magical energy flowed through the earth like underground rivers. The power here was immense, primal, barely contained by the Academy's control systems. Lyra was already there, having snuck in through maintenance tunnels. She'd drawn elaborate circles on the cavern floor, created focus points using crystals and rare materials, prepared everything needed for the manifestation ritual. "Ready?" she asked Kale's shadow form. "As I'll ever be. Let's bring me back." Lyra began the ritual, channeling the Nexus's power through her carefully constructed spell work. Kale felt his consciousness being compressed, drawn together from its dispersed state, given structure and substance. Pain, not physical, but something deeper, as his awareness was forced into a configuration it hadn't held in months. Shadow coalesced into flesh. Energy became bone and muscle. Dispersed consciousness reformed into a singular mind anchored in a singular body. Kale Voidstrider stood in the ley line nexus chamber, physical and present for the first time since his battle with the Chancellor. His new body was constructed from pure magical energy, shaped to resemble human form. It wouldn't last, maybe hours, maybe days, but for now, he was real. "It worked," Lyra breathed. "I can't believe it actually worked. How do I look?" "Like someone who died and came back from spite alone. Perfect for our purposes." Kale smiled, feeling the unfamiliar stretch of facial muscles. "Then let's go crash the Chancellor's ceremony and ruin his day." But before they could leave the Nexus chamber, alarms began wailing. Red lights flashed throughout the Academy's magical infrastructure. The Chancellor's voice boomed through every communication crystal. "Intruder in the ley line nexus. All Ascended converge immediately." They'd been detected, and the entire Academy was about to come down on them. "We need to move," Sarah's voice echoed through the shadows. "The resistance within is buying you time, but we can't hold for long. Get to the main courtyard where the investigation committee is watching the ceremony. Testify publicly where the Chancellor can't silence you without admitting everything." Kale and Lyra ran, racing through corridors as Ascended converged from all directions. The resistance within fought their own people, using their access to the Matrix to create confusion and delay. But the Chancellor was too powerful, his control too absolute. He began simply overriding resistant Ascended, turning them back into extensions of his will. They're sacrificing themselves for this, Kale realized as he felt consciousnesses winking out, absorbed completely into the collective. "We have to make it count." They burst into the main courtyard just as the Chancellor finished a speech about the Academy's commitment to transparency. Hundreds of people stared in shock as Kale emerged, his temporary body glowing with barely contained magical energy. "That's far enough," the Chancellor said, his voice cold. "Guards, remove these intruders." "I am Kale Voidstrider," Kale announced, his voice magically amplified to reach everyone present. 872 years ago, the Mage Council imprisoned me for attempting to expose this institution's crimes. I have returned to finish what I started. This academy, and dozens like it across the continent, exploit their students through a magical construct called the Eternal Matrix. They drain life force, destroy individual consciousness, and maintain a system of immortality built on systematic exploitation. The crowd erupted in confusion. The investigation committee members stood, demanding order. The Chancellor's perfect composure finally cracked, rage visible on his features. "This is fantasy and lies," he declared. "A desperate attempt by our enemies to... I have testimony from 47 Ascended students who regained enough consciousness to understand what was done to them," Kale continued. "I have documentation spanning 7 centuries proving systemic knowledge of the harm caused. And I have the backing of independent investigators who verified every claim. This institution is built on exploitation, and I'm here to tear it. Down! You're here to die, the Chancellor snarled, dropping all pretense. Again! The Ascended moved as one, converging on Kale and Lyra from all directions. But they weren't alone. Members of the investigation committee conjured shields. Independent mages in the crowd rose to help, and even some Academy students threw themselves between the Ascended and their targets. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Magic flew in every direction, shields clashing with attacks, allies and enemies mixing in confusing combat. And at the center of it all, Kale faced the Chancellor, two consciousnesses who'd spent centuries locked in this same fundamental conflict. You should have stayed dead, the Chancellor hissed. Probably, Kale agreed. But I've never been very good at doing what I'm supposed to. And the final battle began. The battle in the courtyard lasted 3 minutes before the Consortium's Enforcement Division arrived and forcibly separated everyone. Both Kale and the Chancellor were placed under magical restraint. Not arrested exactly, but prevented from continuing the fight while the situation was sorted out. The investigation committee demanded immediate access to Academy records. The Chancellor refused, citing institutional privacy. The stalemate might have continued indefinitely, but one of the Ascended, a woman who'd been fully absorbed into the Matrix for 2 centuries, suddenly broke free of the collective control long enough to shout, "Check the financial records, the life force allocation budgets." She was immediately pulled back into the Matrix's grip, but the damage was done. The committee had a specific lead to follow. Within days, they'd assembled damning evidence. The Academy's own records, kept meticulously for centuries, detailed exactly how much life force was drained from each Ascended student, and how it was distributed to sustain older members of the Matrix. It was all there, documented in cold, bureaucratic language that made the exploitation seem routine. The Consortium had no choice but to act. They placed the Academy under official investigation, froze its operations, and began the process of determining what should be done with an institution that was simultaneously one of the most prestigious educational centers in the world and a centuries-old system of systematic exploitation. The Chancellor was detained, though detained meant something different for a consciousness distributed across thousands of bodies. They had to physically isolate every Ascended connected to the Matrix, preventing them from coordinating or reforming their collective awareness. It was a logistical nightmare. Kale's temporary body was failing. Lyra's manifestation ritual could only hold his consciousness in physical form for a limited time. But he'd accomplished what he needed. The truth was out, verified by multiple independent sources, impossible to suppress or deny. As his physical form began dissolving back into shadow, Kale spoke one final time to the investigation committee. The students bound to the Matrix. They're victims, not criminals. Whatever punishment you decide for this institution, make sure you're finding ways to restore their autonomy, not just destroying what they've become. We'll do everything we can, the committee chair promised. But we don't know if it's even possible to separate individual consciousness from a collective that's been integrated for decades or centuries. Then figure it out. They deserve that much. Kale's body dissolved completely, his consciousness dispersing back into the Academy's magical infrastructure. But this time felt different. The Matrix was in chaos, the Chancellor's grip weakening, and individual consciousnesses were emerging, like stars appearing after a storm. The resistance within was winning. Over the following months, specialists from across the continent converged on the Academy to work on separating individual students from the eternal Matrix. It was delicate, dangerous work. Pulling consciousness from a collective that had been integrated for years risked destroying the very individuals they were trying to save. But slowly, carefully, they succeeded. One by one, Ascended students were disconnected from the Matrix. Some emerged with their sense of self mostly intact. Others were deeply traumatized, their memories fragmented, their identity uncertain. A few couldn't be separated without killing them. They'd been part of the collective for so long that no individual consciousness remained to extract. Sarah was among the first to be freed. When she woke up, truly herself, for the first time in months, her silver eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd lost myself forever," she whispered to Lyra, who'd stayed to help with the extraction process. Being part of the Matrix was like drowning, while forgetting what air felt like. You stop struggling because you forget there's anything to struggle toward. You're free now. That's what matters. Because of Kale. Where is he? I want to thank him. He's around. Everywhere and nowhere. Really, his consciousness is dispersed through the Academy's magical systems. He can't manifest physically anymore. But he's aware, watching, helping, where he can. Sarah looked around the room as if she might spot a shadow that was more aware than others. "Thank you," she said to the empty air. "For not forgetting us. For fighting even when it seemed impossible." In the shadows, Kale heard her and felt something like peace. This was why he'd endured. For moments like this, when exploitation ended and freedom began, the Chancellor wasn't so fortunate. As the Matrix was systematically dismantled, his consciousness lost its anchoring points. The vast collective awareness that had existed across thousands of bodies began fragmenting, pieces of identity scattering like ashes in wind. They tried to preserve some coherent sense of self, but it was unclear if anything remained that could be called truly individual. Some said he died. Others claimed he still existed, trapped in a very different kind of prison, aware but powerless, a consciousness without form or influence. Kyle didn't know which was true, and found he didn't particularly care. Justice or mercy, the Chancellor, was no longer a threat. The Academy of Immortals was officially dissolved. The buildings became a museum and memorial to the exploitation that had occurred there, a reminder of how noble institutions could be corrupted toward terrible ends. Students were transferred to other schools, ones that had been thoroughly investigated to ensure they weren't running similar schemes, and across the continent, other institutions connected to the Matrix were exposed and dismantled. Some went quietly, recognizing that the game was over. Others fought viciously, trying to protect their centuries-old systems. But momentum was against them. Public opinion, united by outrage over the Academy's crimes, demanded accountability. It took 5 years, but eventually, the entire network was brought down. Thousands of trapped mages were freed. Systems of exploitation were torn, out root and branch. The magical world underwent a reckoning, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about what it had allowed to flourish. Kale watched it all from his dispersed existence, satisfied that his impossible crusade had succeeded. 872 years of imprisonment, and he'd still managed to finish what he started. But there was one more thing he needed to do. Thomas Brightwood, the student Kale had saved from ascension by leaving the curse intact, visited the Academy's ruins 5 years after its dissolution. He'd spent that time investigating what the Academy had really been, trying to understand what he'd been saved from. He stood in what used to be the main courtyard, now empty and overgrown, and spoke to the shadows. "Kale Voidstrider, I know you're still here. I can feel your presence in this place. I came to say thank you, and to ask if there's anything I can do to help you find peace." In the shadows, Kale stirred. He'd been contemplating his own existence lately, wondering what happened to a consciousness that existed without physical form for too long. He was stable, aware, but was he really alive in any meaningful sense? He manifested a voice from the darkness. "Thomas, you've done well for yourself. I've been watching your career. Impressive work in curse theory. Because you taught me that curses could be tools of liberation, instead of just weapons. You saved me without even knowing me. That shaped everything I became. I'm glad. You deserved better than what the Academy would have made you." What about you? You achieved everything you set out to do. The Academy is gone. The Matrix is destroyed. The exploitation ended. But you're still here, trapped in a different kind of prison. Is this really what you want? Cale hadn't allowed himself to think about that question. I don't know. This existence is strange. I'm aware. I can interact with the world in limited ways. But I'm not really living. I'm more like an echo of who I was. Lyra thinks there might be a way to give you proper form again. Not temporary like before, but permanent. She's been researching for years, working with the best magical theorists she can find. But it would require your cooperation, and she wasn't sure you'd want it. Why wouldn't I want it? Because it would mean truly letting go of the past. The consciousness as shadow existence you have now is sustained by your connection to the Academy's ruins, to the memories of what happened here. Reforming into a physical body would mean severing that connection, accepting that this chapter is over. Some people prefer holding on to meaningful pain rather than moving toward uncertain peace. Cale was quiet considering this. He'd defined himself by his crusade for so long, first as a prisoner enduring in hopes of eventual justice, then as an investigator working to expose the Academy, then as a warrior fighting to tear the system down. What was he without that purpose? Don't know how to be anything other than someone fighting against the Academy. Then learn. You have time. All the time in the world now that they're gone. You could become someone who builds instead of tears down. Someone who teaches instead of fights. Or you could remain as you are, a guardian spirit watching over the ruins of your victory. Either choice is valid. When did you become so wise? Thomas smiled. I had a good teacher briefly. He showed me that refusing false immortality in favor of authentic life was worth the sacrifice. I'm just applying that lesson differently. Over the following weeks, Cale thought deeply about Thomas's offer. He consulted with Sarah, with Lyra, with Mira, with the other former students who'd been freed from the Matrix. What they told him was unanimous. They'd all struggled with defining themselves outside the system that had shaped them, but they'd found the struggle worthwhile. You spent 800 years in darkness staying alive through pure determination, Sarah told him. Imagine what you could accomplish with that same determination focused on something other than revenge. The world needs people who understand systematic exploitation, Lyra added. Not to fight it, you already won that fight, but to prevent it from recurring. Who better to teach the next generation about how institutions can go wrong than someone who's lived it? Even Mira, typically pragmatic to the point of cynicism, encouraged him. You're too useful to stay as a disembodied shadow. Come back. Help us build the new systems that replace what you destroyed. Make sure we don't make the same mistakes. So Cale agreed to let Lyra attempt the restoration ritual. It was exponentially more complex than the temporary manifestation had been. They were essentially creating a new body from scratch and permanently anchoring his consciousness to it. The risk of failure was high. The possibility of dying in the process very real. But Cale had been taking risks for 877 years. One more wouldn't hurt. The ritual took 3 days. Mages from across the continent contributed their expertise and power. Former Ascended students who'd been freed from the Matrix volunteered their energy, wanting to give back to the one who'd liberated them. Even some consortium officials, who'd initially opposed Cale's crusade, came to help, having realized he'd been right all along. On the 3rd day, as dawn broke over the Academy's ruins, the ritual reached its culmination. Shadow and substance merged. Dispersed consciousness coalesced. Energy became flesh and bone. Cale Voidstrider stood in his new body, truly alive for the first time in nearly 9 centuries. He looked different than before. Younger, despite his ancient consciousness, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of centuries. But the essential him was unchanged, still stubborn, still determined, still someone who wouldn't let injustice stand unchallenged. "Welcome back," Lyra said, smiling. "How does it feel?" Cale flexed his hands, feeling the solidity of physical form. "Strange. Good. Like I'm finally home after the longest journey imaginable." They held a ceremony marking the Academy's official transition from active site to memorial. Cale gave a speech about remembering the past without being imprisoned by it, about learning from mistakes without being defined by them. He spoke of the students who'd been exploited, honoring their sacrifice while celebrating their liberation. And then, to everyone's surprise, he announced he would be opening a school. "Not an academy," he clarified. "Nothing so grand or formal, just a place where people can learn magic without exploitation, where questions are encouraged instead of punished, where students are treated as individuals instead of resources to be harvested. I don't know if it'll succeed, but I spent 800 years fighting against something terrible. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left building something good." The school started small, Cale, Lyra, and Sarah, teaching 15 students in a repurposed building in the Undercity. They had no prestigious reputation, no centuries of history, no guarantee of success. But they had something more important: genuine commitment to their students' well-being. Word spread. Within a year, they had 50 students. Within 5, 200. The school developed a reputation for producing mages, who were skilled, ethical, and capable of thinking independently. Graduates spoke openly about their experiences, both positive and negative, instead of reciting identical rehearsed testimonials. It was everything the Academy should have been and never was. Kyle found purpose in teaching, discovered talents for mentorship he'd never known he possessed. He was demanding but fair, pushed students toward excellence without exploiting them. And crucially, he never promised immortality. Life was finite, he taught, and that finitude gave it meaning. 10 years after the Academy's fall, Thomas Brightwood visited Cale's school to give a guest lecture on curse theory. Afterward, they sat together watching students practice spells in the courtyard. "You did it," Thomas said quietly. "You destroyed the old system and built something better to replace it. That's rarer than you'd think. I had a lot of help, and I had 800 years to think about what needed changing." "Any regrets?" Kyle considered this. "Only one. I wish I'd been able to save everyone. The students who went through Ascension, before I could stop it, the ones who couldn't be separated from the Matrix, the people who died trying to expose the truth over the centuries. They deserved better. You gave them justice. That's not nothing." "No, it's not nothing." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd been shaped by the same institution in very different ways, both finding peace in its absence. 20 years after escaping the abyssal dungeon, Cale Voidstrider stood before his students on graduation day. They were a diverse group: humans, elves, dwarves, and species that hadn't been part of magical society in his original lifetime. All of them were eager, talented, and remarkably free of the fear that had characterized students at the old academy. "Magic is power," Kyle told them, his voice carrying clearly. "But power without conscience is just exploitation wearing a fancier name. You've spent years here learning not just how to use magic, but when and why. That's what will define you as mages. Not how powerful you become, but what you choose to do with that power." He looked at their faces, seeing hope and determination, and the kind of idealism that survived despite knowing how dark the world could be. These students would face challenges. Some would succeed, others would fail. All would make mistakes. But they do so as individuals, not as components of someone else's agenda. "The Academy of Immortals promised eternal life," Cale continued. "I'm not going to make that promise. Your lives will be finite, measured in decades rather than centuries, but they'll be your own lives, lived according to your own values. And honestly, that's a better deal than any false immortality could ever offer." After the ceremony, as students celebrated with families and friends, Sarah approached Cale. She'd become his colleague over the years, teaching necromancy with an emphasis on ethical spirit work. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The intensity of fighting the Academy, having a clear enemy to oppose." "Sometimes," Kyle admitted. "Life is quieter now, less dramatic. But I spent 800 years in darkness, and another 10 in constant conflict. Quiet is nice for a change." "What will you do when this generation of students graduates and the next one starts? Just keep teaching forever?" "Probably not forever. But for now, yes. There's satisfaction in helping people achieve their potential without exploiting them in the process. It's the opposite of what the Academy did, and that feels like the right way to honor everyone they harmed." Mira attended the graduation too, her information network having evolved into a legitimate research organization. She found Kale during the reception. "I have news," she said quietly. "We found 3 more Matrix-style systems operating in remote regions. Small operations, but same basic structure. Collective consciousness feeding on student life force. Your crusade isn't quite over." Kale felt the old fire stirring. "Where?" "The eastern reaches. The Twilight provinces. One in the southern archipelago. All of them claiming to be reformed institutions, but showing the same statistical patterns you identified. Subtle. Exploitation is still exploitation." "Exactly. So I'm assembling a team to investigate. Thought you might want to be involved." Kale looked around at his students, his school, the life he'd built. He could stay here, continue teaching, maintain his hard-won peace, or he could take up the fight again, root out the remaining systems that continued the Academy's crimes. It wasn't really a choice. "Give me 2 weeks to arrange things here. Then I'm in." Mira smiled. "Thought you'd say that. Some battles are worth fighting, even when you've already won the war. Especially then. The victory isn't secure until every trace of the poison is gone." Later that evening, Kale stood alone in his office, looking at a map marked with the locations Mira had identified. 3 more systems to dismantle, 3 more institutions to expose, 3 more chances to free students from exploitation. He was 897 years old, granted a second chance at life after nearly 9 centuries of imprisonment. Most people would have retired, sought peace, tried to recover from that kind of trauma. But Kale had never been most people. He was someone who'd survived the impossible through sheer stubborn determination. Someone who'd torn down one of the most powerful institutions in the magical world because it was the right thing to do. And apparently, he wasn't done yet. As he marked his map with investigation plans, Kyle smiled. The work was never finished. There would always be systems that needed reforming, exploitation that needed exposing, students who needed protecting, but that was fine. He had time now. He had allies. He had purpose. The abyssal dungeon had tried to break him with 800 years of darkness. The Academy had tried to silence him with imprisonment and suppression. Both had failed. Kale Voidstrider was free, alive, and ready to fight as many battles as it took to ensure no one else suffered what he had. Some things were worth sacrificing for. Some fights were worth finishing. And some people were too stubborn to give up, no matter how many centuries stood against them. And that's where our story ends for now, with Kyle standing at the beginning of a new crusade, having won one impossible fight and preparing for the next. An 800-year-old dark mage who refused to be broken, who turned his suffering into strength, and who dedicated centuries to tearing down systems of exploitation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Kale's story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more Manhwa recaps. We bring you the stories that keep you up at night, the characters who refuse to give up, and the plots that twist in ways you never see coming. Drop a comment about what you think Kale should do next, or what series you'd like to see covered on the channel. Do you think he should keep fighting or finally rest? What would you do with 800 years of compressed rage and determination? Until next time, keep reading, keep dreaming, and remember, sometimes the darkest magic comes from refusing to accept defeat. Thanks for watching.